Bound by Grace, the journey of Jonathan and Leah. Episode 1. The beginning and the first struggles. Jonathan and Leah met in the small church they both attended in their rural hometown. She was a quiet, gentle spirit with a heart for serving, while he was the confident son of a preacher full of zeal for God. At 22 and 20, they had no doubts about their love and felt sure they were ready for marriage. After a whirlwind romance, they exchanged vows in a simple ceremony, surrounded by family and friends who believed they were destined for a life of happiness. In the early days of their marriage, it felt as if they were living a dream. They would spend hours talking about their future, their plans to build a family, and how they would serve God together. Their love was young, fresh, and strong, held tightly by their shared faith and determination. But as the years went on, they would find that love alone wasn't enough to hold a marriage together. After their first child, Sarah, was born, life began to shift. Jonathan worked long hours as a salesman, traveling frequently, while Leah stayed home, managing the household and caring for their daughter. With each passing day, they spoke less and argued more. Jonathan would come home exhausted, and Leah, overwhelmed by loneliness, Zrenia, would try to express her frustrations. They were both running on empty, but neither knew how to stop and refuel their love for each other. One night, after another tense argument, Jonathan stormed out, leaving Leah in tears. She cried out to God, wondering where the joy and unity they once had gone. It was the first of many moments where divorce seemed like a viable option, but something inside Leah whispered that God wasn't finished with them yet. The day Leah discovered Jonathan's infidelity shattered her world. She had suspected for months that something was off. His late nights, secretive phone calls, and the emotional distance between them had grown too great to ignore. But when the truth came out, the pain was deeper than she could have imagined. Jonathan had fallen into an affair with a co-worker, something Leah never thought possible from the man who once pledged his life to her under God's guidance. For days, Leah couldn't look at him. She couldn't pray, couldn't eat, and couldn't even think clearly. She wanted to leave. Every fiber of her being screamed for her to run. But in the stillness of the night, God whispered to her heart, "Forgive." It was the hardest command she had ever received from God. How could she forgive such a betrayal? Yet, somehow, through tearful prayers and wrestling with her pain, Leah began to ask God for the strength to forgive. She wasn't ready to heal, but she was ready to start. Jonathan's shame weighed heavy on him. He knew he had sinned, not just against Leah, but against God. He remembered the vows they had made, standing before the altar, and how far he had fallen from those promises. The affair had ended, but the damage was done, and he feared it was irreparable. Jonathan fell to his knees one night in their empty bedroom, crying out to God for forgiveness and mercy. He confessed everything to Leah, tears streaming down his face as he begged for another chance. He knew he didn't deserve her forgiveness, but Leah, guided by her faith and God's quiet voice, listened. Her heart was still raw, but she saw in Jonathan a broken man desperate for grace. Slowly, they began the long journey toward healing. As they tried to rebuild their marriage, another storm hit. Jonathan lost his job, plunging their family into financial hardship. The bills piled up, and tensions ran high. They fought about money more than ever. Every decision seemed like a monumental struggle, and their faith in each other and God was once again tested. Leah took on part-time work to make ends meet, while Jonathan scrambled to find a new job. Despite their best efforts, they struggled to keep their heads above water. The stress only deepened the cracks in their relationship, and both wondered if this was the breaking point. Yet, through every sleepless night and every desperate prayer, they clung to one truth. God had brought them this far. Somehow, He would make a way. The years that followed were quiet, but heavy. Jonathan and Leah no longer spoke about divorce, but they also didn't talk about much else. Their once lively home became a place of routine and silence. They had grown used to the distance between them. It was easier to coexist than to confront the brokenness that still lingered beneath the surface. They went to church, served their community, and raised their children, but inside they felt like strangers. Leah often prayed for a miracle, for God to reignite the love they once had. She knew that staying together was an act of obedience to God, but she longed for more than just staying. She wanted to love Jonathan again, truly, deeply. But that seemed like a faraway dream. As Jonathan turned 50, something in him shifted. Perhaps it was age, or perhaps it was the gentle tug of the Holy Spirit, but he began to reflect deeply on his life and his marriage. He realized that though they had survived so many storms, they had never truly healed. One evening, after a sermon on forgiveness and restoration, Jonathan took Leah's hand and asked her for a fresh start. It wasn't an easy conversation. Leah had buried years of pain and disappointment, and Jonathan had to confront the many ways he had failed her. But for the first time in years, they both chose to be vulnerable. Through tear-filled prayers and late-night talks, they began to rediscover each other, not just as husband and wife, but as friends and partners in God's plan. With renewed faith and a commitment to each other, Jonathan and Leah started to see the fruit of their perseverance. They leaned on God more than ever, trusting that He had a purpose in their journey. The love they once thought was lost began to grow again, stronger and more resilient. They still faced challenges, but now they faced them together, with God at the center of their marriage. As their 50th wedding anniversary approached, Jonathan and Leah looked back at the decades of hardship, betrayal, and heartache. They had every reason to walk away from each other, but they didn't. God had held them together, weaving their brokenness into a story of grace and redemption. Now in their 50s, Jonathan and Leah found themselves counseling younger couples in their church, sharing their story of struggle and triumph. They didn't sugarcoat the pain or the mistakes, but they always pointed back to God's faithfulness. Their marriage was far from perfect, but it was a testament to the power of grace, forgiveness, and unwavering faith in God's ability to restore what was broken. Their children, now grown, saw the transformation in their parents and were deeply moved by the love that had been rekindled. What once seemed impossible had become a beautiful testimony of God's mercy. Jonathan and Leah knew that the road ahead would still have challenges, but they were ready to face them together. The silent years had left scars deeper than either Jonathan or Leah realized. They had grown so accustomed to burying their pain and pretending everything was fine that when they finally started talking again, they found there were years of unresolved issues between them. Every conversation felt like walking through a minefield of old wounds, each one threatening to undo the fragile peace they had built. Leah struggled with the bitterness she still harbored toward Jonathan. She had forgiven him in principle, but her heart still hurt, and she didn't know how to let go of the anger she felt. Jonathan, on the other hand, felt an overwhelming sense of guilt. Every time Leah brought up the past, he felt like he was being pulled back into the man he used to be, a man he hated. They both realized they needed help, and so they sought counseling at their church, hoping to finally put the past behind them. In counseling, they were forced to confront the root of their problems. Leah admitted that her bitterness was eating away at her, and Jonathan confessed that his guilt had kept him from fully engaging in their marriage. Their pastor encouraged them to bring everything to God, every resentment, every hurt, every unspoken feeling that had been festering in their hearts. It was during one of these sessions that Jonathan, with tears in his eyes, confessed something that shocked Leah. He hadn't just felt guilty about the affair, he had also felt unworthy of her love ever since it happened. He had been waiting for her to leave him, convinced that he didn't deserve to be her husband. Leah was stunned. She had always assumed Jonathan's distance came from his own selfishness or indifference, but now she realized that he had been just as broken as she was. In that moment, they both cried out to God, asking for healing, not just for their marriage, but for their individual hearts. Through counseling, they learned that the real enemy of their marriage wasn't each other. It was the lies they had believed. Leah had believed the lie that Jonathan's affair was her fault, that if she had been a better wife, he wouldn't have strayed. Jonathan had believed the lie that he could never truly be forgiven, that his mistake had forever defined him as unworthy. These lies had kept them in bondage for years, but now they were ready to fight for their freedom. They began to pray together, something they hadn't done in years. It was awkward at first, but over time they found that praying together helped them stay connected in ways they hadn't expected. When they prayed, they were reminded that they were on the same side, that God had brought them together for a reason, and He wasn't finished with them yet. One of the hardest parts of their journey was rebuilding the trust that had been broken. Leah still struggled with insecurity, especially when Jonathan was away from home for work. She didn't want to admit it, but every time he was gone for more than a day, her mind would wander to dark places. Was he really at work? Was there someone else? The doubts would creep in, uninvited, and steal her peace. Jonathan, for his part, knew that rebuilding trust would take time. He didn't get defensive when Leah expressed her fears. Instead, he was patient with her. He would call her multiple times a day, reassuring her of his faithfulness. It wasn't easy, but over time, Leah began to believe that Jonathan truly had changed. Their trust wasn't rebuilt overnight, but with each small act of faithfulness, they moved closer to each other. Jonathan's patience with Leah's fears and Leah's willingness to be honest about her pain became the building blocks of a new foundation, a foundation stronger than the one they had in their youth. In the midst of their personal healing, Jonathan and Leah faced a new challenge, this time with their daughter, Sarah. Now in her 20s, Sarah was struggling with her own faith. She had grown up in the church, but the tension she had witnessed in her parents' marriage had deeply affected her. Though she had never spoken about it, Sarah had harbored a quiet resentment toward both of them, feeling as though their faith had failed them. If marriage, supposedly ordained by God, could be so hard, then what did that say about the God they had taught her to trust? One evening, after an emotional confrontation, Sarah confessed to her parents that she didn't know if she believed in God anymore. Leah's heart broke. She realized that in focusing so much on their marriage, she hadn't noticed how much Sarah had been hurting. Jonathan felt the same pang of guilt. They both knew that this was a battle they couldn't fight alone, and they began to pray fervently for their daughter's heart to be restored to faith. Leah felt a new burden, this time for her daughter's soul. She had always prayed for Sarah, but now her prayers became more desperate, more urgent. Every morning she would rise before the sun, kneeling in the quiet of her living room, pleading with God to reveal himself to Sarah in a way she couldn't deny. There were moments when Leah wondered if she was praying in vain. Weeks turned into months, and Sarah seemed more distant from God than ever. She had started dating a man who wasn't a believer, and though Leah tried to offer gentle guidance, she feared that she was pushing Sarah further away. Jonathan, too, was troubled, but he encouraged Leah to stay the course. "God isn't finished with her yet," he would remind her. And so Leah kept praying, even when it felt like nothing was changing. One Sunday morning, after months of feeling distant from the church, Sarah surprised her parents by joining them for service. Leah's heart swelled with hope, but she tried not to get ahead of herself. She knew this might just be a one-time thing. But as the sermon unfolded, something in Sarah shifted. The pastor spoke about the story of the prodigal son, and as Sarah listened, she felt a weight lift off her shoulders. It was as if God himself was speaking directly to her, telling her that no matter how far she had strayed, he was waiting for her with open arms. By the time the service ended, Sarah was in tears. She turned to her parents, her voice shaky but sincere. "I think I'm ready to come back," she whispered. Leah could hardly contain her emotions. It was the answer to a prayer she had been praying for what felt like a lifetime. That day marked the beginning of Sarah's return to faith, and Jonathan and Leah were there to walk with her every step of the way. With Sarah's return to faith, Jonathan and Leah found a new sense of purpose. They had endured so much pain in their marriage, but seeing their daughter come back to God gave them hope that restoration was possible in all areas of their lives. However, restoration came at a cost. The deep wounds from the past still needed healing, and the effects of their strained marriage had left lasting marks on their family. Sarah began to open up about how their relationship struggles had affected her growing up. "I didn't understand why God would let you guys suffer like that," she said one evening, sitting with her parents at the kitchen table. Leah's heart ached hearing this. She and Jonathan had thought they were protecting their children by keeping their issues private, but the tension had seeped into their home, impacting their children more than they realized. It was a hard pill to swallow, but it reminded Jonathan and Leah that healing wasn't just about them. They needed to be intentional about mending their relationship with Sarah too, creating an environment of love and honesty in their home once again. Jonathan and Leah's journey toward healing was slow but steady. After years of praying, counseling, and learning to be vulnerable with each other, they found themselves in a place they hadn't been in for decades, hopeful. They weren't perfect by any means, but they had learned how to communicate, how to forgive, and most importantly, how to lean on God in their darkest moments. For their 30th wedding anniversary, Jonathan planned something special. He knew that after all they had been through, they needed a fresh start, a new beginning. Without telling Leah, he arranged a vow renewal ceremony, inviting only their closest family and friends. Leah was overwhelmed with emotion when she saw the small gathering at their church, where they had first exchanged vows all those years ago. As Jonathan stood before her, tears in his eyes, he promised her once again that he would be faithful, that he would cherish her, and that he would honor the covenant they had made before God. Leah, her heart full, made her own promise, to love him through the good and the bad, to forgive as Christ had forgiven her, and to always put God first in their marriage. It was a moment of renewal, not just for their marriage, but for their souls. For the first time in years, Jonathan and Leah began to rekindle the romance that had once defined their early years of marriage. It wasn't the passionate whirlwind romance of their youth, but something deeper, something more meaningful. They started making time for each other again, taking walks together, having date nights, and just talking like they hadn't in years. Leah noticed small things about Jonathan that she had long forgotten. His gentle smile, the way his eyes lit up when he talked about something he was passionate about. Jonathan, too, saw Leah with fresh eyes. The years had changed them both physically, but the beauty he saw in her was more than skin deep. It was the beauty of a woman who had stood by him through the darkest of times, a woman who had chosen to love him when he didn't deserve it. As they spent more time together, they laughed more, held hands more, and even began to dream together again. The years of pain had not stolen their love, they had simply given it new depth and meaning. The transformation in Jonathan and Leah's marriage began to ripple out into other areas of their lives. Their children noticed the change, not just in how they interacted with each other, but in the atmosphere of their home. There was a peace now, a sense of stability that hadn't been there before. It was as if the weight of years of tension had finally lifted. Jonathan and Leah also found themselves with a renewed sense of purpose in their church. Couples began seeking them out for advice, asking how they had managed to stay together after everything they had been through. Jonathan would often laugh and say, "It wasn't us. It was God." But in their hearts they knew it was more than that. It was the willingness to surrender their pain to God, to trust Him even when it didn't make sense, and to keep fighting for their marriage, no matter how hopeless it seemed. Leah found herself mentoring younger women, sharing the lessons she had learned about forgiveness, patience, and the importance of keeping God at the center of a marriage. Jonathan, too, began leading a men's group at church, speaking openly about his own failures and the grace he had found in Christ. Their story, once filled with so much pain, had become a testimony of God's power to heal and restore what was broken. As Jonathan and Leah approached their 50s, they found themselves looking ahead with a new perspective. They had spent so many years focused on surviving the next crisis that they had forgotten what it meant to dream about the future. But now, with God at the center of their marriage, they began to think about what the next chapter of their lives might look like. They talked about traveling, about spending more time with their grandchildren, and about how they could continue to serve in their church. But more than anything, they talked about continuing to grow closer to each other and to God. They knew there would still be challenges ahead. Life was never easy. But they had learned how to face those challenges together with faith and grace. Their love, once fragile and broken, had been transformed into something unshakable. It wasn't perfect, but it was real, forged in the fires of pain and redemption. And as they looked toward the future, they knew one thing for certain: whatever came next, they would face it together. Even in the midst of their newfound peace, Jonathan and Leah couldn't help but feel the weight of regret from time to time. There were moments when Leah would look back at the years they had lost to bitterness and pain and wonder how things could have been different if they had made different choices. The what-ifs haunted her at times, especially when she thought about how their children had been affected. Jonathan, too, had his own struggles. Despite the healing they had experienced, the memory of his infidelity still lingered in the back of his mind. He would often wake up in the middle of the night, guilt tugging at his heart. Though Leah had forgiven him, he had not fully forgiven himself. He knew that God had redeemed him, but the shame of his past mistakes still weighed heavily on him. One evening, as they sat together on the porch, Leah spoke softly. "Do you ever feel like we wasted so many years fighting the wrong battles?" Jonathan sighed, his eyes downcast. "Every day," he admitted. But then he reached for her hand, and as their fingers intertwined, he said, "But I also believe that every year, every tear, and every fight brought us here. And maybe, just maybe, we had to go through all of that to get to this place." Leah nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. They had been through so much, and while the regret would always be there, they knew they couldn't let it define their future. Leah found herself wrestling with the past one morning while reading her Bible. She stumbled across a passage that spoke of laying down burdens and trusting God to carry the weight of the past. As she read those words, she realized that while she had forgiven Jonathan, she hadn't fully surrendered her own regrets to God. The pain of lost years still clung to her like a shadow, and it was time to let go. That afternoon, she approached Jonathan, who was reading in his study. "I've been holding on to something," she confessed. Jonathan looked up, surprised. "What do you mean?" Leah took a deep breath, the words catching in her throat. "I've been holding on to the regret of everything we lost. The years we spent hurting each other, the pain we caused our children. I've forgiven you, but I haven't forgiven myself." Jonathan stood up, walked over to her, and wrapped her in a tight embrace. "Leah, we've both made mistakes. We've both caused pain, but you're right. It's time to let it go. God's already forgiven us. We need to forgive ourselves." Please subscribe for that you won't miss episode 2.